It's July 1943. North Africa has been secured. The massive combined power of the Allies, America, Britain, and Canada, is coiled like a spring, ready to strike. But where? Winston Churchill famously called it the soft underbelly of Axis-controlled Europe. Others, looking at the same objective, saw a hardened mountainous fortress. This is the story of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. It was the largest amphibious operation in human history at that point, a campaign defined by massive egos, brutal combat, logistical chaos, and a strategic victory that would change the course of the war. This is the Allied perspective, from the men at the very top to the dog-faced soldiers who paid the price for every mile. After the victory in North Africa, the Allied High Command was split. The Americans, led by General George Marshall, were focused on one thing: a cross-channel invasion of France, as soon as possible. But the British, led by Churchill and General Sir Alan Brooke, argued for a peripheral strategy. Strike at the Mediterranean, knock Italy out of the war, and force Germany to divert precious troops away from the Eastern Front. The British argument won. The target? Sicily. The man put in overall command was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was the supreme commander, but his real job was managing the two most difficult, brilliant, and prickly subordinates in the Allied Army, the American General George S. Patton and the British General Bernard Montgomery. The plan was, on paper, straightforward. Montgomery's veteran British Eighth Army would land on the southeast coast and push north up the east coast to the key port of Messina. Patton's brand-new, untested U.S. Seventh Army would land on the southern coast, protect Monty's flank. Patton was not a man who liked being a flank guard. But before they could even load the ships, they had to pull off one of the greatest deceptions in military history: Operation Mincemeat. The Allies planted false documents on a corpse, dressed him as a British Royal Marine officer, and let him wash ashore in Spain, knowing the info would get to the Germans. The top-secret plans? They detailed an upcoming invasion of Greece and Sardinia, with Sicily only as a diversion. Hitler bought it. He diverted troops and ships, leaving Sicily, the real target, critically undermanned. D-Day for Sicily was July 10th, 1943. But the invasion began the night before, with one of the most disastrous airborne operations of the war. American and British paratroopers were to drop inland to seize key bridges and disrupt the Axis response. But a massive, unforecasted gale force wind blew the formations apart. Pilots got lost. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Allied invasion fleet, jumpy and on high alert, mistook their own planes for enemy bombers. In a storm of friendly fire, 23 Allied transport planes were shot down. Hundreds of paratroopers were killed before even touching the ground. One American paratrooper, Sergeant Penrose L. Johnson, remembered, "The tracers were coming up from the ships and from the shore. They were so thick you could almost walk on them. The plane was hit and it went down. I was the last man out. I was supposed to be a pathfinder to mark the drop zone. I spent the next 3 days just trying to find an American." Most of the airborne troops were scattered across 60 miles of Sicilian countryside. But this disaster had an accidental silver lining. The Germans were getting reports of Allied paratroopers everywhere, and their response was total confusion. At dawn, the main event began. 160,000 men, 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft. This was the true scale of Operation Husky. The British Eighth Army, hardened by years of fighting Rommel in the desert, landed against light Italian resistance and began their push. The Canadians, in their first major combat of the war, fought brilliantly. For the Americans, it was a baptism by fire. The famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle was on a ship off Gela. He captured the raw, terrible newness of it all for the American GIs. We were all starters in a brand new, frightening, and deadly game. I want to tell you what the shore of Sicily looked like that morning. It was covered with khaki-clad bodies, with the water washing gently over them. These were the first, the pioneers. They had a job to do, and they'd done it. The bullets and the shell fire that killed them had been meant for the thousands who would come after them, and who did come. The Americans faced a vicious German counterattack at Gela. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division slammed into the 1st Infantry Division's beachhead. For a few terrifying hours, it was touch and go. But with desperate, accurate fire from naval guns just offshore, the Americans held. They were on the island to stay. After the landings, the campaign split into 2 stories. Montgomery's 8th Army, advancing up the east coast toward Messina, ran into the toughest German defenders on the island, dug into the foothills of Mount Etna. It became a brutal, grinding World War I-style slog. And then there was Patton. His orders were to guard Monty's flank. But Patton saw his chance. In a controversial move, he split his army. He sent 1 corps to drive west, and in a lightning 7-day campaign, they captured Palermo, taking 53,000 Italian prisoners. Patton's men were greeted as liberators. This made Patton a superstar back home, but it infuriated his British counterpart, Monty, and his boss, General Harold Alexander, who saw it as a pointless glory dash that diverted resources. But Patton wasn't done. He now turned his sights on the real prize. Messina. The campaign became a 2-man race. Monty, the cautious, methodical hedgehog versus Patton, the aggressive, ambitious bull. For the soldiers on the ground, the race to Messina was hell. Sicily in summer is brutal. The heat was stifling. Dust was everywhere. And the Germans were masters of defensive warfare. This became a mule and mosquito campaign. The mountains were too steep for trucks. Soldiers relied on mules and their own backs to carry ammo and water. And at night, malaria-carrying mosquitoes were a deadlier enemy than the Germans. More Americans were put out of action by malaria in Sicily than by German bullets. The fighting was up close, personal, and brutal. Private Audie Murphy, who would later become the most decorated soldier of the war, got his start here. He remembered the German booby traps and the cold efficiency of their retreat. They were professionals. They'd hold a ridge just long enough to make us deploy our entire force. We'd spend hours setting up an attack, and by the time we assaulted, they'd be gone, leaving behind mines, tripwires, and a few snipers to make our lives miserable. Then they'd do it all over again at the next ridge. It was during this brutal advance that Patton committed the acts that would nearly end his career. While visiting field hospitals, he infamously slapped 2 different soldiers suffering from shell shock, or what we now call PTSD, calling them cowards. When Eisenhower found out, he was apoplectic. I am well aware of the fact that firm and drastic measures are sometimes necessary, but I will not tolerate brutal or bullying methods. I am giving you this one and only warning. Your personal, goddamned, egotistical opinion of yourself is not going to run this army. Patton was forced to apologize, but the incidents were covered up. The old blood and guts persona was great for morale, but it concealed a volatile and, at times, unstable command. Patton's 7th Army entered Messina on August 17, 1943, just hours ahead of the British. The 38-day campaign was over. Sicily had been conquered. But the victory was bittersweet. In the 6 days before Messina fell, the Germans and Italians had pulled off a masterful evacuation. Over 100,000 Axis soldiers, 10,000 vehicles, and 17,000 tons of supplies were ferried across the narrow Strait of Messina to mainland Italy, all while under Allied air attack. The Allies had won the island, but the German army had escaped to fight another day. The price was high. Allied casualties, over 22,000. U.S., 8,781 with 2,237 killed. British, 11,549 with 2,721 killed. Canadian, 2,310 with 562 killed. Axis casualties, estimated over 164,000, but the vast majority, 130,000, were Italian soldiers who surrendered with little fight. So, was it worth it? From a strategic level, absolutely. The effects on Axis morale were catastrophic. Even before the campaign was over, on July 25th, the shock of the invasion caused the Italian Grand Council to depose Benito Mussolini. The fascist dictator was arrested. Italy was, for all intents and purposes, out of the war. Hitler was forced to divert dozens of divisions to Italy to cover the collapse, troops he desperately needed on the Eastern Front against the Russians. For the Allies, Sicily was a hard, vital lesson. They had proven their massive combined arms, air, sea, and land, could work. They had learned how not to run an airborne operation. And Eisenhower had learned how to manage the egos of his star generals. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the U.S. Second Corps under Patton, summed it all up. Sicily was a laboratory, a testing ground for our weapons, our tactics, and our men. We paid for our education in blood, but the lessons we learned here about logistics, about amphibious warfare, about fighting the Germans, would be the ones that would carry us to Normandy and all the way to Berlin. The invasion of Sicily is often overshadowed by D-Day, but it shouldn't be. It was the beginning of the end for fascist Italy, the first step back onto the European continent, and the moment the American, British, and Canadian armies proved they could fight as one. It was a campaign won by the general's ambition and paid for by the soldier's grit, and it was the bloody, necessary dress rehearsal for the liberation of Europe.